Good afternoon, Zoom, and we're here for our fourth session of the introduction to Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation, written by forgot Christopher Young something. Come on. Anyway, here we go. Will 9. It's going to upset me shortly. So I just read over this last one as best I can. I don't know as best I can, it's a figure of speech. It wasn't literal. The structure of the fourth book is initially hard to follow. It has very long sections that are especially rich in content, and it is punctuated by deliberate postponements of the main argument. It is a matter for some debate whether the disjointedness is more than just presentational. The debate, I was meant to put a full stop there. Yeah, we'll just go back. Oh, you son of a bitch. Look, it's crashed again. How can you crashing, you idiot? Okay. This button. Crashed. Look at me, I didn't even cry. I'll try it again. Well, I'll close this one just because it's not needed right now. I'm really crying. Oh, look, I've got a smoker signal. Right. Because you wanted to see the front of the book, I suppose. It's the Cambridge edition of the works of Schopenhauer, volume 1. And look in here, so we go back to the spot we're up to. So here. Where was I? No, it's doing that. The debate points out that we have the overarching vision of the worthlessness of human existence and the redemptive power of self-abolition. But how does this idea of the inherent worthlessness of humanity yet relate to what we might call Schopenhauer's more ordinary ethical views concerning motivation, responsibility, and the moral worth of compassionate, non-egoistic actions? All of these ethical considerations he interjects into his discussion of what is the world. Oh, now we have to get back to that spot. We have to click the link. And there we are. Section 5 announces the first postponement of the question of affirmation and negation to discuss the issue of free will. The essentials of Schopenhauer's views on this topic are as follows. Footnote 10. The self-contained prize essay on the freedom of the will that Schopenhauer published in 1841 as one of the two fundamental problems of ethics is his best treatment of the question of free will. And when he came to revise the World as Will and Representation in 1844, he chose to refer the reader to that essay rather than attempt any major recasting. See 316. So we've got the essentials of Schopenhauer's views on his topic are as follows. On his topic. And that's the first postponement in question about the affirmation and negation, to discuss the issue of free will. The essentials of Schopenhauer's views on this topic of free will are as follows. The essentials. No individual human actions are free. Okay, so that's right. I'll just make some room, Michelle. There. No free will. I'll indent that. It was a print. What have we got? No free will. No individual human's actions are free. They are events in the world of appearance and subject to the principles of sufficient reason. Motives occur and, given the character of the individual being, the individual human being to whom they occur, the resulting actions are a necessary consequence. They are events in the world of appearance and subject to the principle of sufficient reason. Motives occur. That was something. What was that? Just a bit of space repetition. Can I search? I don't think so. Not that weird. This one. I can do that. Try and search. I'll just search for motives. Whoops. For motive. Do. On the four-file row. Okay, so I'll be in that section. Everything that happens to determine every action relates back to a motive and its agents. So to be in that spot. What is the relation of motive to action? Is motive as movement or reason? The chief points he makes on the topic of willing in the fourfold root are as follows. Inner self-consciousness and outer consciousness, cognition, the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding. For Schopenhauer, within self-consciousness are movements of the will. So it's the movement, isn't it? Acting, trying, deciding, desiring, and registering affects and feelings. The bot affect, raw impulses equals to feelings, emotional tones, desires, motives, inclinations. Action, bodily movements is one continuous chain of willing. Okay. Outer consciousness and self-consciousness aren't quite distinct and yet are both governed by cause and effect. Schopenhauer explains that when self-consciousness is moved by some experience in outer consciousness, an act of will occurs. This sequence is what Schopenhauer calls a motive. Motivation, he says in a memorable phrase is causality seen from within. Schopenhauer calls a motive an experience that moves me to action. Okay, so an experience that moves me to action. An experience that moves me to action. Motives occur. And given the character of the individual human being to whom they occur, the resulting actions are a necessary consequence. Human actions are indeed vastly different in character from all other instances of willing by virtue of their potential to be rationally motivated. But this is not sufficient for free will in Schopenhauer's view. We see that a human being has the advantage over animals of possessing the ability to choose by virtue of abstract or rational cognition, but this only makes him a battleground for conflicting motives and does not remove him from their control. Thus, while this ability indeed conditions the possibility of the complete expression of the individual character, it can by no means be seen as a freedom of individual willing. That is, it does not signify any independence from the law of causality, whose necessity extends to human beings just as it does to every other appearance. It seems to us, subjectively, that we are free because we can reflect and are aware that no motive absolutely necessitates any action. However, each individual's character is fixed, and the combination of a present motive and the fixed disposition of our character necessitates that we will. Our character is empirical. We learn about it in our own case as in that of others, only as it unfolds over time. But the empirical character is just the temporal reflection of our intelligible, non-empirical character that remains timelessly the same. Schopenhauer takes the contrast of empirical and intelligible characters from Kant and comments later that this is really the point where Kant's philosophy leads to my own, or where my own grows from the stem of Kant's. See 531 in Appendix, Critique on Kantian Philosophy. Although the metaphor is apt only if we think of grafting on a plant of a different species, not least because Kant thinks of the intelligible aspect of the human character as purely rational and as antithetical to what the human being is by nature. Both points on which Schopenhauer fundamentally disagrees. An important message from the discussion of free will in the world as will and representation is slipped in right at the beginning of section 55. It is that the will as thing in itself is free. Existing beyond the realm of representation, the will as thing in itself is not constrained by any of the forms of necessity that attach to the principle of sufficient reason. And if, as Schopenhauer insists, we define freedom negatively as the absence of necessity, then the will is, as thing in itself, is free. Why one would want to say this is unclear if one is forced in the usual way on the question whether my individual willing is free focused. But while he resolutely denies the latter kind of freedom, Schopenhauer here lights the long-burning fuse that leads to his final solution of the will's freely negating itself. Why has it got a possession here? Of the will freely negating itself. It's the will itself, the will's, what is it possessing? Or is it plural? The wills. In section 56, Schopenhauer reminds us, again, that the theme is affirmation and negation of the will, but immediately sidesteps once more, this time to examine the nature of willing and its satisfaction in an important discussion that proceeds through sections 57 to 59. In section 56, Schopenhauer reminds us again that the theme is affirmation and negation of the will, but immediately sidesteps once more, this time to examine the nature of willing and its satisfaction in an important discussion that proceeds through these two sections. Willing always occurs because something is felt as lacking. It is, as such, a form of suffering. But then attaining an end through willing, what we call happiness, brings us nothing of positive value because it just temporarily erases a pain of lack or absence. New desires flood in almost immediately to plague us with their non-satisfaction. And if no new desires arrive, we are tormented by boredom. We never reach a lasting satisfaction. There is no such thing in the life of a willing being. So human life is bound to be a strenuous but ultimately empty game of dispositionally inescapable of true happiness, essentially a multifaceted suffering and a thoroughly disastrous condition. Schopenhauer claims to have shown this a priori. It applies constitutively to the very condition of living as an individual whose essence is willing. And it is not the result of induction from empirical investigations of the world. Nonetheless, the tour through the species of human reality would lead one to the same conclusion. If you lead the most unrepentant optimist through the hospitals, military wards, and surgical theatres, through the prisons, torture chambers, and slave stalls, through battlefields and places of judgment, and then open for him all the dark dwellings of misery that hide from cold curiosity, and finally let him peer into Ugolino's starvation chamber, then he too would surely come to see the nature of this beast of all possible worlds. In section 60, the theme of affirmation and negation is addressed more squarely. It is natural for us to affirm the will to life, the bodily drive of the core of living things, all of which strive quite unreflectively to be alive and to produce more life beyond themselves. The drive to sexual activity in animals, including humans, is the most fundamental expression of the affirmation of the will to life, which is one reason why it is wrong to think of it merely as a will to live. And the genitals are the parts of the body in which will manifests itself in most concentrated form, almost free of any admixture of intellect. The sex drive for Schopenhauer is the ultimate purpose, the highest goal of life in the natural human being. It is as it is in the animal. In affirming its will to life, each living thing also naturally seeks its own well-being. This is what Schopenhauer calls egoism, and the discussion of it in section 61 leads him into his main treatment of justice, law, and morality in the world as will and representation. Again, there is a clearer and more concentrated account of these topics in Schopenhauer's essay on the basis of morals, though the essentials of both discussions are the same. Each individual regards him or herself as the center of the world, and in Schopenhauer's memorable image, quote, just as a captain sits in a boat, trusting the weak little vessel as the raging, boundless sea rises up and casts down howling cliffs of waves, so the human individual sits calmly in a world full of sorrow, supported by and trusting in the principium individuationis, which is how the individual cognizes things as appearance. The boundless world, where everywhere full of suffering with its infinite past and infinite future, is alien to him. In fact, it is a fairy tale. His vanishing little person, his unextended present, his momentary comfort, these alone have reality for him. So we each strive primarily on our own behalf, and the affirmation of the will by one individual inevitably impinges harmfully on the sphere of expression of others' will. An action that imposes on the will of other individuals is, in this way, is wrong, and the institutions of law, justice, and punishment exist to deter individuals from such wrongful affirmation of their wills. Right, meanwhile, is simply the negative correlate of this. In section 62, we hear about conscience, an inner pain felt by a perpetrator of wrong, which, according to Schopenhauer, reveals an awareness of the perpetrator's underlying identity with the wronged party. After a discussion in 63 of eternal justice, the notion that there is an equilibrium in the world between the amount of suffering inflicted and the amount endured, and that it is all deserved. If human beings were not on the whole worthless, then their fate would not be on the whole so sad. Schopenhauer turns in sections 64 to 67 to his account of morality proper. Morality concerns affirmation and non-affirmation of the will in a particular sense. No egoistic action can have genuine moral worth, and still less an action out of malice in which the exercise of one's own will is expressly aimed at negating the well-being of another, even with no gain to itself. No egoistic action can have genuine moral worth, and still less an action out of malice, in which the exercise of one's own will is expressly aimed at negating the well-being of another, even with no gain to oneself. Okay. Moral worth is attained only when someone makes less of a distinction than is usually made between himself and others. The resulting morally good actions, which meet with approbation from third parties and a particular kind of inner self-satisfaction, are of two kinds. They can arise either from a disposition to voluntary justice or from pure unselfish love or loving kindness. Mention Leiby, which Schopenhauer equates with compassion, Mitlied 12 in BM, chapter 3, III. Schopenhauer treats both voluntary justice and loving kindness as manifestations of Mitlied. The virtue of involuntary justice resides in an inbuilt sense of the capacity for suffering in other individuals that leads one to refrain from harming them or prevent their coming to harm. In the case of loving kindness, actual cognition of the suffering of others' motives, no possession, one motivates. In the case of loving kindness, actual cognition of the suffering of others motivates one to alleviate it, often at the expense of suffering of one's own. The most extreme form of this, which has a paradigmatic status for Schopenhauer, is self-sacrifice for the good of others. Schopenhauer's explanation of those genuinely moral incentives is that they rest on being able to see through the principle of individuation as the veil of Maya, illusion, that features in Indian thought. The morally good person glimpses in a direct and untutored way the unity of all expressions of the will, does not consider him or herself as something apart from the whole, and hence sets everyone's suffering on a par or even attributes more significance to that of others than to his or her own. In section 68, Schopenhauer finally arrives at the culmination of his argument and states, I will now show how from the same source that gives rise to all goodness, love, virtue, and nobility, there ultimately emerges also what I call the negation of the will to life. This distinction then occupies him through to the end of the fourth book. This extreme conclusion to the book advocates a kind of extinction of the natural self, and although the technical details of this process are anything but clear, the intensity of Schopenhauer's conviction shines through his purposeful prose in a manner that is both impressive and disquieting. The tone is close to being religious here, and the vocabulary is that of saintliness, conversion, redemption, and grace. In Schopenhauer's view, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism all contain elements of the same wisdom, provided one sets aside entirely all their accumulated clutter of deities, dogmas, and fanciful metaphysics. There is no God, no creator. There are no divine entities, spirits, or immortal souls, no intelligent plan, purpose, or perfection to this world. But there is the possibility for human beings, albeit not for all, of an internal transformation, which Schopenhauer calls the will's self-negation, Selbstvernichtung, or self-abolition, Selbstaufhebung. But then this one's the negation, self-negation. Or is it sublimation? The idea of it's Hegel's word, isn't it? The idea is that something stops the individual from willing on his or her own benefit at all. Experience of the world no longer motivates him or her to action in pursuit of goals or flight from harm. He or she attains an elevated state of passivity in which the world is seen as if from nowhere within it, and his or her individual character or person is extinguished. This is, we are told, a blissful emptiness, no striving, no suffering, which may seem from the standpoint of our unaltered consciousness to be a dreadful state of nothing. But Schopenhauer imagines that once one has made the transition, our whole world of representation must also dwindle in significance and indeed be seen as nothing. Numerous questions can be raised about this account. One is this: if extinction of my person is so blissful an occurrence, ought I not to commit suicide? Schopenhauer addresses this pressing issue in section 69. His answer is a resolute no. Suicide is an error which solves nothing. The person who commits suicide because he has suffered greatly and sees no fulfillment in this world for his strivings is deluded. He still regards fulfillment of his individual striving as something in principle attainable and valuable. Greatly superior to this is continuing to exist with an attitude of resignation in the face of all suffering. How, though, does the state of selfless redemption relate to moral goodness? In a letter to one of his most philosophically astute correspondents, Johann August Becker, surname, CGB 222, letter to Johann August Becker, December 10, 1944. Schopenhauer explains that the value moral actions in a letter to one of his most philosophically astute correspondents, Johann August Becker. Schopenhauer explains that the value moral actions have for the one who performs them is a transcendental one. Such actions lead him on the sole path of salvation, that is, deliverance from this world of being born, suffering and dying. He refers to WWRI, section 68, Hubster SW 2448, and the rest. The person who is so morally good that the distinction between him or herself and others begins to fall away feels all the suffering throughout the world as if it were his or her own. This leads to resignation, tranquilizing of the will, or its recoil away from life. One grasps the utter lack of value in living and willing as an individual at all. Only by undergoing such an extreme redemptive transformation in consciousness can the individual's existence attain genuine worth. And morality has value, ultimately, not in its own right, but because it is a step toward this self-denial of the will. When I feel compassion, rather than simply exercising my individual will and sensing there is something awry with so doing, I am alive to the will of others as having an import equal to mine or greater, indeed greater than it. But this feeling ultimately has value only because it takes me a step nearer to an abandonment of my individuality, which Schopenhauer can express by saying that the will which freely manifested itself as me freely annuls itself in me. It remains unclear how satisfactory this position is. Compassionate moral goodness and extreme will-lessness both involve a shift away from egoism, the natural affirmation of the will of the individual. Both involve removing the sense of uniqueness and security that the typical unenlightened human being invests in his vanishing little person, his unextended present, his momentary comfort. But morality, as Schopenhauer conceives it, surely involves willing, often vehemently willing and acting on behalf of others. Choosing to sacrifice oneself in battle to save other lives is a passionate and personal act, not a lapse into impersonal, will-less detachment. And on the other side of the coin, why or how would the suffering of any living thing matter to the will-less subject whose individual personality and capacity to be motivated have been extinguished? It's a good question. Morality would seem to belong to what has been left behind by someone in the ultimate state of salvation. That's enough. Oh, I'll finish at that heading. There are further questions concerning the way in which such a state is supposed to come about. Schopenhauer says that someone who reaches the ultimate pitch of selfless love and benevolence, a saint or great soul, does so by attaining a kind of knowledge or cognition. He or she recognizes the whole, comprehends its essence, and finds that it is constantly passing away, caught up in vain strivings, in a conflict and perpetual suffering. This is a unique kind of insight in which one comes to see, not through argument or conceptual thinking, but intuitively, that all beings suffer and all beings are but deceptive manifestations of the same essence. This cognition, Schopenhauer says many times, acts as a quietive, a sedative or tranquilizer of the will inside oneself. One recoils from all the goals and pleasures of all the world, turn towards asceticism, and attains an inner peace and joy. It is exceptional to reach this insight through one's sheer degree of selfless saintliness. Another more frequent secondary route, itself not exactly common, it must be said, is to gain the same cognitive enlightenment through experiencing suffering itself. The sheer brutality of one's particular life can purify one's vision and lead to the same recoil of the will. But does Schopenhauer think that such exceptional individuals will to become will-less? On the one hand, Schopenhauer states that it is not an act of the individual's will that brings about the state of resigned will-lessness. Rather, that negation of the will, that entrance into freedom, cannot be forced by any intention or resolution, but rather emerges from the innermost relation of cognition to willing in human beings, and thus arrives suddenly, as if flying in from outside. That is precisely why the Church calls it the effect of divine grace. But just as the Church thinks that this is still dependent on the acceptance of grace, the effect of the tranquilizer is also ultimately an act of the freedom of the will. It is not the will of the particular human individual caught up in space and time that freely acquiesces in the insight into the world of suffering. Rather, it is the will itself it is the will in itself whose freedom Schopenhauer asserts earlier on. On Schopenhauer's account of cause and effect, it is hard to see how cognition can literally be having an effect on the will, while at the same time the will is acting freely. But part of what he has in mind seems to be that the extraordinary form of cognition now fails outright to motivate the subject to act, and instead presents the world as an arena for pure contemplation. On the other hand, he talks of deliberately seeking out ascetic practices to assist in the will's self-abolition. And is sure that willlessness is a different and unstable condition that one must struggle hard to maintain. So an absolutely clean break between willing and willlessness seems in the end not to be achievable for human beings. Neither of the two aspects of the self that compete throughout the world as will and representation, self as embodied, will-driven individual, and self as pure, pain, free subject. Let me try that again. Neither of the two aspects of the self are competent that compete. Neither of the two aspects of the self that compete throughout the book, self as embodied, will-driven individual, and self as pure, pain-free subject, yields entirely to the other, and we never escape the threat of some kind of inner turmoil. Nearly finished. I didn't take many notes then, did I? It's just raining. Didn't grasp it all. Not as well as I do when I take lots of notes. Anyway. Now I'm gonna turn off the recording and read something else. What shall I read? Deleuze? Deleuze, Nature and Philosophy? I haven't read that for a while. Yeah, I think so as well. So I'll just delete this bit because I just want it as a heading, so. Like so, just so I know where I finished. Oh, it's probably a good idea to link that, isn't it? Yeah. I just link it this way. Just a little bit. And I just do that. It's the link. It's the link. Nice. There we go. There we go. All right, I'll bring you back in later when I get to my next rating all ready. So I'll just end it for everyone, I think. I don't know how to do that. So I'll just pause it, stop the recording. Bye now.